Welcome, and thanks for tuning in to Strange Static. Tonight's broadcast, Yesterday's Blood by Conor Walsh, featuring the voice talents of Noble Eclipse VA. The iridescent droplets of acid rain had fallen more and more sparsely since sunset. Soon the sky would hold its breath for the first time this season, allowing a blessed silence to ring through the scrapyard. But Ivanov would not linger to enjoy it. He made his final preparations. He shouldered his pack, the distraction flares and medical rations clinking within, checked and rechecked his armored environment suit, and inspected his rifle as closely as he could in the dim green glow light of his hideout. The weapon had been resurfaced and repaired so many times it now resembled a bent length of steel and scrap more than any firearm. It would serve better as a crutch than a gun, and considering how long his journey would be, and how cruel the advance of age had been on him since the end of days, there was a high chance it would be used as such. Had he decided to undertake this journey a dozen years ago, it would already have been difficult. Now difficult had devolved into near impossible. The joint reinforcements on his left leg squealed as if to remind him of such, and though he'd applied extra rat grease that morning, he worried nonetheless. Scything machines teemed in the junkyard, and it would only take the smallest of unexpected noises for them to descend upon him and slash him to ribbons of flesh. It had happened to better men than he. But he was reaching the bleak darkness at the edge of his life, and there was one last right he needed to wrong, or die trying. He knelt with effort, pulling a misshapen black valise out from beneath his bunk and undoing the clasps. Within was a stretched billfold, fattened by its contents. He held it gingerly and with one shaking index finger pushed the white fabric peeking from within back into the leather. With great care, he slid it into an interior pocket. If the item he sought to return was torn from him, all his preparation, all the pain to come, would be for nothing, if it wasn't already. There came a sharp click, the soft mutter of gears upon gears, then an electric blip from his watch as the hour struck 1. Ivanov allowed himself a moment to linger, a brief hesitation in the quiet darkness of the cargo container that had been his home for so many desolate years. He listened to the soft creaking, the pattern of irregular footsteps from a rodent deep in the scrapyard, the familiar hum of far-removed mechanical dealers of death. Leaving this place would bring him only pain. He slid open the barricaded door and stepped into the night beyond. Black-green odors, acidifying metal, rusted scrapwork, ancient death, all assaulted him like enemy fire. The dead world probed at his scratched goggles, worked its nails into his mask's filter, gleeful at the chance to snuff out the few remaining gasps of life left to him. Deep in the recesses of his rucksack, 6 gas mask filters clicked and bounced against one another, each time he took a step, not one of them unused. They would last him a combined 16 hours if none of them failed. His trip would take 17. The metal brace around his knee chided him with its high metal voice as he quickened pace. He had chosen a good night for his journey, insofar as any such night could still exist. Clouds stained green by the tint of his goggles clung to the moon, but its light still issued across the scraplands, like the last benevolent act of a dead god. Sometimes he would look up at the mining colonies, still blinking red, and wonder at the survivors of the human race. Did they think everyone on Earth dead? Did they know that a select few unfortunates, like Ivanov, like the woman he journeyed to see, still plodded away their lives like rats cowering from the heavy footfalls of their steel oppressors? The exiled cultures wouldn't have visited pity on him even if they could. There was no path. Ivanov slinked among trash from the dead world, dodging the acid puddles, avoiding the lethal droplets from overhangs. The slightest splash could spell doom. His suit only barely held together, like his rifle, like his life. A collection of detritus no different from any other garbage. He walked. As he rounded a bend between the headless corpse of a scrapped war machine and a junked car, something darted out from the shadowed heaps. Like the trained soldier he once had been, Ivanov hefted his rifle and fired, but his muscles lagged behind his aim and his shot went wide, managing only to send a bucket careening into nothingness. His assailant, a mechanical insect the size of a bull terrier, glittered in a slab of moonlight. Then there was a font of pain boiling in his leg. He swung his rifle but only struck dirt, and the metal insect was gone anyway. Blood pooled from twin perforations in his calf. He'd barely made it a half mile. The insect hadn't violated his suit's integrity completely. He was able to work a suction patch into place before the burning air did more than scald his flesh. The thought of returning home flicked in his head like a match. But another memory, of a half-considered set of words, of guards pursuing someone who had done nothing at all, caught in his head before he could smother it completely. The guilt had chased him away from the remnants of humanity, chased him into the junkyard, chased away his autumn years. No, he would no longer be its slave. 2 hours of arthritic pain passed before he finally spotted the halfway point. The moon peered coquettishly from behind the broken, rust-stained spire of a colossal watchtower, where broken and bent cannons jutted like arrow shafts. A century ago, it had stood sentinel against the enemies of whatever country this once had been, but its prime was long past. Close to the tower, he stopped. Whether from the waning eyesight of age or from the acrid film across his visor, he'd missed a crucial detail. At the tower's apex, clinging to the side with its sharp metal claws, a scyther machine loomed against the moon like a gargoyle out of prehistoric myth. It was a metal skeleton, just as rusted as the tower, but awash in jagged implements of death, its trio of red eyes inset into a bulletproof metal mask, glowing like embers. It had spotted him the moment he entered its patrol radius, and now it was watching and waiting for a threat display or any sign of weakness, at which point it would leap 100 yards in the air to land on him and turn him into a spatter of red sinew. No raising his rifle, no hope in fleeing. Even immobility was a false choice. The machine could have been there years already, could remain there for hundreds more, and the clouds in the distance promised another influx of acid rain long before then. He had only one chance. In one of his myriad pouches was an IR transmitter that he'd scavenged from a long-dead checkpoint machine. Such a device would allow him to disguise himself to mechanical eyes as a fellow machine. But the transmitter had sparked and flickered like a dying light bulb when he'd found it, and though he'd done his utmost to breathe new life into it, it never functioned for more than a minute and a half. Slowly, motioning like he was adjusting a strap, he slipped a hand into his shoulder pouch. The scyther machine vanished from its vantage. A moment later, he felt the crash in front of him, heard the whistling of airborne metal, and the blade that slashed in front of his face caught the moonlight and became a solid cleaver of molten white. A new flower of pain bloomed in his arm. But he could still see the scyther, and if he could still see it, that meant it hadn't torn him apart. Slowly, he retracted his hand from his pocket, looking the killing machine dead in its 3 eyes. In the moonlight, its hulking shape was a silhouette of black, an angel or a demon from a heaven long burned, weighing whether to take him into oblivion. He ran before it could make its decision. But he only made it a few hundred yards before he lurched. The blade had sunk through his left bicep, a comparatively minor wound for a scyther to make, considering the chunks of flesh he had seen other victims become, but still a grievous injury. Worse, it had further compromised his suit's integrity, and though he had a few mending patches to fix a hole here or there, it was clear he hadn't brought nearly enough. The IR transmitter continued to blip, a heart monitor on his sleeve. Once it seized, the scyther would snap up the distance between them to finish its deadly work. Forcing himself up, Ivanov tried not to focus on the pain, but it was nearly impossible. His inner sleeve was slick, all up and down his arm and chest. He dangled his rifle by its strap, sometimes using the weapon as a crutch, sometimes wielding it as an impotent sword against the unseen monsters in the seething blue-black that could descend upon him at any time. In this state, he'd never be able to aim properly, let alone get a shot off. Yet somehow he made it to the edge of the scrapyard. Beyond the spires of the dead past stood an armada of ghosts, myriad gray corpses of thousands of trees which banded together like spears against his entry. A hard black patch of untainted earth called to him, and he fell to his knees, a refrigerator left unused for 50 years his sole companion. Panting, he took a knife from his belt and probed the soaked fabric on his arm. The wound was a thin black line leaking further black as he watched. It was impossible to see how deep it was, but he could barely move his fingers. He slipped his still-functioning hand into one pack, then another, failing to find the emergency kit for several long, terrifying moments. At last he felt the cold plastic, and began the painful work of sealing the gash. He looked out on the horizon to distract himself from his painful work, though what remained of the countryside was hardly a comfort. The night was mercilessly clear, and though they were hundreds of miles distant, the cloud-scraping harvesting machines seemed much too close as they slowly crept their way across the world on their 16 shovel legs. There were 6 in sight, the closest perhaps 100 miles away, but he knew there were thousands more just as he had no clue as to their true purpose. Without warning, the horizon bloomed a brilliant orange, burning the landscape into his retinas, the shadows of the dead trees like millions of tiny hands clawing at the sky. The machines had sighted a target. The earth-shaking echo of the mortars came, and the branches shivered in the wake of the backblasts. One of the harvesting machines swiveled, but thankfully it was turning away. Then there was silence. Ivanov gave a long breath as the sealant on his arm took hold. He would live another few minutes at least. Shakily, he stood, moving slowly into the tree line. It would be difficult to find the mud and scrapwork home at the edge of the wood, the home he'd spotted her outside of 2.5 years ago as he watched through his binoculars, but his sense of direction had at least remained mostly intact as he'd aged. He was sure it had been the same woman. He didn't know her name, but he didn't have to. She had the same mole below her left eye, the eyes that he remembered so well even all these years after his boyhood, fixed on him with a combination of fear and rage as she fled into a back alley, the armed guards close at her heels. Even now, a tremor ran through him, and he wrapped his fingers around his left bicep and squeezed. The pain surged through his body and threatened to force its way through his mouth in a scream. But he held fast, and the agony brought him back to himself. Something in one of his pouches popped. The IR transmitter had held admirably, but his shoddy electrical work had finally spelled its doom. Any roving machine still infesting the Grey Woods would be able to recognize him as a potential target now. He hoped the trees would impede their progress. Soon, however, he realized the gnarled roots and close trunks were a much greater issue for his own progress. After 3 near misses and 1 bad fall that caused a pouch to split open and ruin a dozen rounds of ammunition, he resigned himself to a slow, plodding pace. Every time he lifted his braced knee over a root, his arthritis-riddled joint screamed in pain. The chained moon lowered gradually, like a punctured balloon, counting down the hours until he would inevitably be forced into the sickly daylight and the burning rains, and the sharp branches hid in every dark shadow of the forest, stabbing out at him like hidden spears, tearing new holes in his suit. He had long since given up stopping to repair them, and his exposed skin had soon become inflamed and itchy in the poisoned air. The trees parted, and Ivanov found himself in a clearing not on his mental map. A half-dozen shacks, each in varying levels of disrepair, huddled around the remnants of an armored vehicle. Abandoned for years, perhaps even before the end of days. Or so Ivanov thought, until he took a step forward and heard a soft crunch. It was a familiar sound, yet nothing like the cracking of branches and twigs that had accompanied him since he first entered the forest. A black bone lay in pieces at his feet, the lone visible remnant of a corpse that had since turned to black dirt. Among the fallen walls of the shacks, he could make out other long-rotted bodies, black smears of what had once been blood years ago, old bullet holes. Even as he tried to usher himself on, something still drew Ivanov into the broken buildings. There was nothing in the first but a rotten bunk and rotten furniture, and a few fragmented bits of jagged metal that could have once belonged to a scyther but more likely had once been a booby trap of some kind that had tried and failed to stop the mechanical advance. The second home contained spent rounds for a weapon Ivanov did not recognize, with no signs of the gun itself. But as he came to the doorway of the third building, he caught sight of something that brought 100 old, half-forgotten memories starkly into focus. It was an armored helmet with a cracked visor, not remarkable in itself. But this helmet bore an insignia on the right brow, a blue heart struck through with a black lightning bolt. The old Civilian Defense Force insignia. He'd worn one himself in the years after the end of days, when he tried and failed to protect the dwindling populace from the steel death hounding them at every turn. There was an elastic twang, like an overtuned guitar string, and then a plank of wood was whipping toward his face, brimming with a shock of nails, broken glass, twisted spikes. It was at this critical moment that his brace, long strained, finally buckled, hyperextending his knee and throwing off his balance. The change in position was all that kept the booby trap from driving its razor-sharp payload directly into his face, through his eyes. But it still caught him sidelong. The trap slashed into his gas mask, gouging his mouth and cheeks, shattering the eyepieces, and his lungs suddenly filled with the stink of loam and old death and freshly spilled blood. He tore the ruined mask away and made a low, sad noise like a dying dog, the blood pouring into his mouth even as he spat, and more came to fill it. But the air was the worst, assaulting his face and lungs, setting every wound aflame, making him fight to even breathe. He clawed at one pouch, tore open another, desperate to find anything that might ease the pain, help his breathing. In one he found a pair of spare goggles that he pushed against his eyes, a modicum of relief against the pain, but not enough to protect his lungs. He coughed into his shoulder and his suit trickled red. Suddenly the billowfold was in his hands, unfolded, and the pure white fabric inside was a stark contrast against all that surrounded him. For a moment, a voice cried through the pain, cursing him for even considering tainting the shawl, the fabric that should never have been his. But if he died here, he would never be able to return it. He pushed the fabric to his face, and though it should have lost all odor over the years, the faint smell of a long-extinct flower was just enough to ease his coughing, just enough to filter the poison, just enough to give him the strength to force himself to his feet. Wasn't much farther now. He could take the pain, take anything. After that, he would be at peace. He was certain. Serena stared at the figure loping toward her home. Through the rifle scope, he was distorted, discolored. The red stains all over his body paint on a distant canvas. Nothing had awakened her so early today. Nothing other than the instincts trained by months of solitude. Typically, it was a worthless endeavor, hours spent watching a desolate forest, peering at the walkers on the blasted plains, wondering if they would approach. The most interesting thing she'd ever seen was a sinewy coyote that vanished into the darkness from whence it had come, and that had been half a year ago. Now a stranger was approaching. She had never met a stranger before. Her gaze traveled to the object trailing in the dirt behind him. Something that looked like a metal club, but which she soon realized was a mangled firearm. For a fleeting moment, she trained the crosshairs on his chest, fondling the worn trigger of her rifle. But she heard her mother's voice, a whisper close to her ear and impossibly distant. Now, at the end of it all, we must rely more on one another, while there's still anyone left to rely upon. She slid from her position at the firing slat beside the front door and landed on the dirt floor. There were 2 peepholes, one for her mother, one for her, and though she was almost tall enough to reach the top one, she felt more comfortable squatting down, laying the rifle flat, looking up at the other side from a downward angle. Labored breathing approached the door, a near eternity passing before the man she'd seen before swam into view. He stood in place, panting, coughing once and wiping his mouth. Then he stopped to look down at his feet, and Serena's breath caught, until she realized that he was stopped in contemplation. Or perhaps prayer.
"What do you want?"
she called, watching the old man jerk back, nearly stumble, then catch himself. Something fell from his hand, a stained scarlet flag flapping in the wind. He jerked to catch it, gasping with pain all the while, before regaining some scrap of composure. Is that woman here? The hairs on Serena's neck stood on end. Was he talking about her or her mother? She pushed the barrel of her rifle against the door, aiming vaguely in the man's direction.
"Why?"
No answer came. She chanced to glance through the peephole again and saw only filthy knees, one swollen, the other alarmingly purple. The man was splitting his body weight between his rifle and the door, failing to support himself with either. Blood trickled down the rifle, soaking the dirt. I gotta say something, the man groaned, before sliding to the ground in a dead faint. The man was shockingly easy to carry, as if he'd bled out all of his weight and was now nothing more than a shell. Serena dragged him to the back room of the shack, which had a cot and a few shelves and a small rectangular slit that bled yellow light onto wallpaper once patterned with pastel kittens. Serena hefted him onto the cot, then, gingerly, brought his ruined legs up. Heaving with effort, she found herself unable to look away from his torn suit, his blotchy red skin, his wrinkled, strained face. It seemed silly to her, in a sad kind of way, that a man would choose to suffer so much only to deliver a message. As he lay there, he continued to bleed, and she used a warm, damp towel to dab at the blood soaking the old man's face. One gray, watery eye snapped open. I don't deserve this,
"Okay,
Serena said, continuing to wipe the blood away.
why not?"
I asked about a woman that lives here earlier. Does she still?
"If you mean my mama, she died."
Serena lifted the rag, squeezing the red into a dusty bucket beneath the cot. The old man stared at her, wide-eyed, like she'd said the sun had gone out. Serena met his gaze.
"It was 2 years ago, or something. Fever, got sick, got bedridden, never got up again."
The old man's mouth dropped open. What? She looked down at the bloody rag in her hands, at the matching one that still remained balled in the old man's fist. A long moment passed. When she finally spoke again, her mouth hardly opened.
Sorry.
The old man couldn't look her in the eye. He fixed his gaze on his hands, and when he finally spoke, the words slid from him, knives extracted from a deep wound. Many years ago, when I was your age, I encountered your mother. She was walking alone through the streets of the city we shared. I don't remember its name. But I do remember that our leaders had taught us to distrust the foreign national. That you, were plotters, deceivers. Only allowed into our cities through withered bureaucratic policies. I thought I was above listening to them. His breathing was shaky, and he reached up to wipe his eyes, smearing them with his own blood. I don't know why I did it. I'm not a hateful man, and I wasn't a hateful boy. When the vote was called to exile your people, I was against it. Maybe I was against it because of what I did. But I just had an argument with my own family over I don't remember what. I was angry, and I saw her walking, my age, maybe a little younger, out on the city's periphery, carefree when there was so much to care about. And I knew she hadn't done anything, but with the right words I could hurt her. I spoke before I knew what I was saying, half calling, half teasing, maybe because I knew what I was saying was wrong, maybe because I didn't want to think I was being serious. Our leaders demanded we excise the invaders. Look where all that got us. The old man inclined his good hand, gesturing at nothing at all. But someone heard me, and the guard came from nowhere. As soon as I heard them stomping along, I regretted it, but there was nothing I could do at that point. Your mother looked at me with pure hate. He swallowed. Pure hate. And then she turned and ran like her life depended on it, which I guess it did, and she dropped this. He looked down at the bloody and threadbare scrap in his hands as if he had just remembered it. Then he held it out to Serena, who accepted it mutely. The old man was staring at her, his eyes made large in his bloody, aged face, and the way the light caught him through the slant in the wall made him seem more like a child than an elderly person. She held the rag by its corner, shook it out. But there was nothing remarkable about it, aside from how utterly wet with blood it was. The old man lay back in his cot. When he spoke again, his voice was small, a child's voice. Do you hate me? Before her mother had died, she'd recounted stories of the old cities, just before the end of days. Horrible stories. How their people had been harangued by the regional authority, made scapegoats because of some long-forgotten incident or another. How they had been chased from place to place by citizens of almost every country, never truly knowing peace. Some had fought back, some had been killed, but most were eventually rounded up and sent to the lunar mining colonies. Countless stories of hatred, countless stories of injustice. But to Serena, they were stories from a past she had never known. And the bloody, pathetic old man in front of her was suffering now.
I don't think I hate you,
she said, eventually.
But I do think you're kind of dirty.
The old man's eyes widened. Then he let out a sigh, long held, like the words had been a cure for a disease he'd had all his life. He closed his eyes, lay back in the cot, and was still. For a moment he looked like her mother had looked on the night of her passing, in the very same cot. Serena reached over and poked him in the cheek. The man opened an eye, then shut it again, shifted, trying to attain the same peaceful look that he'd had before. But Serena wouldn't let him, poked him again, and finally he smacked her hand away, his lips pursing, his bleeding forgotten.
Are you trying to die?
Maybe. What's it to you?
You should keep trying to live. That's what I'm doing.
The old man looked exasperated. Didn't you hear my story? I'm a mean old bastard, I'm beyond forgiveness, and I'm probably beyond help. And I got messed up by the machines on the way here. I'll probably be dead of tetanus by this time next week. For all his complaining, his wounds didn't seem nearly as deep as they looked. Serena shrugged.
Mom always said we can't help what happens in the future. Or what happens in the past. All we can worry about is now.
Where there had been exasperation before, now the old man seemed pensive. Your mother was very wise.
Maybe.
It had been a very long time since she'd spoken this much, and the earliness of the hour had suddenly dawned on her.
If you feel bad for what you did, you can make up for it by taking first watch for the machines. I'm going back to sleep.
With that, she left. The old man watched the doorway where she departed. Then he turned to the wall, his face near the slit, as the burning rains began anew, as the chained moon sank beneath the horizon. He kept his eyes fixed where it had vanished for many hours,